This is Matt Dabbs at Discipleship.org. I'm here with Dan Leitz, who's the CEO of the Bonhoeffer Project, and he's been doing that for several years now. And I'm excited to talk to him about how discipleship is not just a curriculum to add cookie cutter addition to your programs or your classes, but is actually a culture and how you form that culture. So we're excited to hear about that, Dan. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Man, thanks for having me. I'm really excited. This is something that I'll tell you is just near and dear to my heart, this subject, because it's what I went through. I went through, kind of the vision, the dream, and then the death of the dream. Because I really, again, I'm a task driven, like, let's get it done kind of guy. So having a robust curriculum is like, man, that's all I need. That's my silver bullet. I got a turnkey, get the good stuff, because I want my people to have the best. And so, I found out very quickly that is not the key to disciple making. It is a thing. So I'm not knocking curriculum. You still need a curriculum, but that's not the goal. That's kind of superfluous to what it is that you're trying to create.
Okay. So, and that's our go-to. Like, we want something in the box, take it out of the box, unpack it, 13 weeks, that sort of thing.
Yep.
So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. It's tempting, and it's kind of the easy button in a sense, but it's just our operating system. It's like what we need to do to fix things. So it's not like it's...
Well, I think it really goes back all the way to kind of the Industrial Revolution, like, let's, put everything, hey, we're making the Model T, just put it on the assembly line. Hey, it worked here. Everybody's cookie cutter. All you got to do is plug in this curriculum and everybody's going to turn out the same. What really struck me, and again, the scriptural kind of backing for this was in Matthew chapter 13, verses 3-9, where Jesus is given the parable of the soil. And he talks about the seed, and he gives the different soil that the seeds fall on. Really what the soil represents, obviously it represents the heart of the individual who receives, but that's the culture. That's the culture of the heart. And I would say just as much as our hearts have a culture, right? Because we're a product of our environment, we're a product of our upbringing. There's a whole lot of culture that's ingrained in us. Our churches have a culture. So as the seed of discipleship and disciple making is being scattered in our church culture, what kind of soil do we got? And that was kind of my first, because, let me go back, a little backstory. 2019, I come to the Disciple Making Forum, and I'm intrigued. I'm like, man, I knew I'd already gotten the bug, and I didn't know what the bug was. I knew that our church needed to make disciples. Not that we weren't making them, but we were not making them with the intentionality that I knew we needed to have. So I was like, man, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it like I'm going to give it the gusto. Like, here we go. So I came to the Disciple Making Forum because I knew there was kind of like a trade show. Everybody's got a booth. And I brought an extra suitcase because I'm going to buy the goods. I'm going to buy all the things. So again, back in my cabinet behind me, I've got all the books that I bought. And I really just thought that if I just create or have the best curriculum, it's kind of like the old, if you build it, they will come. I'll just make sure that I have the best, most robust, most theologically accurate, doctrinally sound, and that'll create it. And then if I just put people through my plan and my system, it'll create what we need to have. And the problem is, first and foremost, like one of the things that I love about Jesus' parables, he's always teaching agriculture. And for anybody who's done farming or, crops or gardening, it is a patient man's game. It is not for someone who is trying to grow like bamboo. It's just, you can't control it after it grows. But when it comes to, like, I was looking at, several weeks ago, I was looking at like apples, thinking about apples, right? An apple tree, if you take a seed today, pull it out of an apple, plant it, you can expect apples in 5 to 8 years. Like, that's a long time. And if you're like me, if you're driven, if you're like, man, let's get it done, you've got a Martha kind of spirit, and you're constantly fighting for, hey, let's go. So then here, hey, you're gonna plant, you're gonna fertilize, you're gonna water, you're gonna let the sun do its thing, and you're just gonna watch even the things spring up and you're like looking at the branches going, come on, like I need some fruit. And you may not see it for a while. You may see the flower, but then no fruit that year, right? That it's just not ready yet. There's not going to be any fruitfulness. And so for me, what I recognized is what my job was as a pastor was to examine the soil. I needed to examine the soil because I came into a church that was already established. So it's different. Church planting, right? You're planting the seed and you get to see it from inception to grow into what it is that you had planned. When you take over a church, when you come in and assume the responsibility, you're looking at a tree and you're going, man, I need to check the root structure. You're tasting fruit. You're a fruit inspector. You're like, is this good fruit? Is it bad fruit? What's wrong with this branch? It hasn't produced in a while. What do I need to do here? So my first step was to examine the soil. But it really boils down to this idea that creating a culture is going to take time. If you are in it for this quick fix mentality, if you think that, oh man, I just need to come up with a good, robust curriculum, 13 weeks, 52 weeks, 28 weeks, that is not going to fix a culture problem. All that is doing is just putting, in a sense, a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Because if the culture isn't disciple making, it's not going to fix. There's a quote I love, Andy Crouch. He wrote a book called Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling. He says, the bigger the change we hope for, the longer we must be willing to invest, work for, and wait for it. So again, if the culture that you have, so we had a culture in our church for many years of multiple ministries, 80 plus ministries in the church. And it was kind of, that was the claim to fame, if you will. This church has 80, 90 ministries. Look at all the different things happening. But it was a little more of like a menu, a choose your own adventure, than here's the mission that this church is on. So taking a kind of and again, I'm not saying this to throw stones at the past, but taking kind of that menu mentality and saying, no, here's the map. This is where we're going. This is the map. This is the road. Here's the destination. Here's the waypoints. Here's some rest stops. Here's what I need you to do, how to fuel up, how to get ready for destination ministry. Man, I'm still working on it, right? So I'm not done yet. I don't want anybody to hear that I've arrived. So just to give you guys a kind of a background up to today, we are about 4 years in to building a purposeful disciple-making culture. And we're still working. Like, we're not there yet. We're seeing some fruit. But I would tell you, it was probably the first 3 years of just examining the soil, looking at the branches, looking at the leaves. Like, are we a church that, kind of keeping with the same analogy of a tree, that our root system is just a mile wide and an inch deep? Or is it a mile deep and an inch wide, right? Like, where is the ratios? Where are we at? Are we robust? Is the tree just as big underneath the soil as it is above the soil? And that process takes a while. And, one of the things that I would say, we had for many people, COVID was hard. For us, there was a blessing in it because the superfluous stuff kind of went away on its own. Like, I didn't have to do much. Like, the ministries that weren't robust just kind of died. They kind of died out. They faded away. The ones that were robust really kind of stayed. There were a few that we still had to kind of deal with and dish out and meet with and say, hey, what does this look like long term? But when it comes to like understanding, you just have to recognize it's not the curriculum, it's the culture. And if you recognize that it's the culture, it's going to take time. So don't get on this path of speed. Speed is not your friend, because speed knocks people off the boat. One of the brother of mine, friend, when I first took over the lead role at this church, my church, Calvary Oceanside, he said, you have to shepherd people through change, not make them victims of the change. So again, you've got to recognize you're a shepherd, you're a leader, you're a ministry director. People need to see what you're doing. And just because you know where you're going doesn't mean everybody knows where you're going. You have to shepherd people in those places, because here's what I got. I got a lot of, we've already done this. We've done this before. Oh, pastor's on a kick. He's on a discipleship kick. Oh, this year is a discipleship year. Next year it'll be evangelism. 2 years from now it'll be mission, whatever. People are used to every year is like a new theme. And so it's 4 years now and people are finally saying, oh, like he's serious. Like he's not giving up on this disciple making thing. So it took 4 years for some people to even think like, oh, this is like a culture thing. This isn't just, oh, this is the flash in the pan. This is pastor read a book this year.
Mm-hmm.
He's really excited about disciple making. No, it's what influences everything that we do. So again, it has an air of, man, if the patient man's going to lose on this one, because this is not something that's going to be done next year or the year after. This is something that if you cultivate it right, not only does it take time, but once the tree is healthy, fruit begets fruit begets fruit. Like there's just going to be, again, what Jesus says in the end of that parable, 30, 60, 100-fold fruit that ends up propagating that you weren't necessarily ready for.
Yeah, and we have some of the issues there, like, okay, if the average preacher, pastor, minister is at a church for 5 years or 6 years, but you're talking a 10, 15, 20-year process,
right?
Constant execution, right? Like we kind of already have a system that's a little bit set up against longevity and against having a consistent effort at producing healthy soil and maintaining the soil, like all those things. But we know God works through process. Like even Jesus took 3 years and they still had a hard time.
That's right. And he still lost one.
Yeah.
He still had Judas.
The Exodus.
Judas didn't make it.
40 years in the wilderness. And that was identity formation, 101 culture formation, leaving the Egyptian slave culture into a culture of promise, covenant, and freedom. Took 40 years. It took the death of a whole generation. You're like, well, I'm going to be here for 4 or 5 years. And, hopefully the next guy you hire will carry on the vision. It's like that's kind of a hard.
And I think that you're touching on something that every pastor, ministry leader, everyone needs to hear right now. You are seasonal. You are temporary. You are here to steward what God has given you for a time. And it is your role and responsibility to raise up the next guy to carry on what you've started. Too many churches, they don't have that mentality. And so every 5, 10, 15, 20 years, a new guy comes in with a new vision. So you're always starting over as a church. I don't want to do that. Even if I recognize that my role, what God's given me in this season, my role as the lead guy in this church is maybe just to establish a healthy tree for the next guy to really get the fruit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, that's saying,
kingdom
right?
mentality. You got to have that kingdom mentality.
Yeah, it's like the planting trees of the shade you'll never sit under. It's like somebody else to enjoy the shade, but that was your calling, was to plant the tree. And then, then we get into American culture, which is exceptionality and expediency.
Correct.
And so as an American, I'm hesitant to invest myself in things that I am not pretty certain are going to be successful.
Right.
And now all of a sudden I'm called to be faithful. The fruit is in the faithfulness, but I may not see a movement spring up. I may not see the church double. I may not see I may reach out to my neighbor for 10 years and they never come around, and And so, but that's what we're called to hang in there, and to keep being faithful. But our American culture fights that a little bit. It's kind of,
big time.
Yeah.
Well, we're an instant results culture. We want Hot Pockets ready in 2 minutes. We want, fast food, expediency, but we want like 3 Michelin star quality. And it's like, dude, those aren't, you can't have them at the same time. It doesn't work that way. You want the quality, it's going to take time. I mean, if you've ever been to a fine dining restaurant, man, when you order, you're going to take especially if it's like a really well-cooked meal. I mean, you're waiting 30 minutes sometimes for your order. Why? Because they're doing it all fresh. Right. Whereas you go to McDonald's, you go to one of these restaurants, they've already got it sitting there ready to go for you. They're just slapping all the things together. So building culture is definitely one of those. It's fine dining. And so you have to slow the culture down in order to kind of see that change. But it kind of led me to my second point, and this is what I got to experience personally, is that when you are the change agent and you're saying, hey, this is what I want to do, it can and will create chaos. Chaos happens because I've kind of listed it, and I don't remember where I got it. So if you know where this came from, you can attribute it to them. But there's 4 stages that people feel, endure, go through anytime that there's change. The first is panic. If you've got something that you've enjoyed and this is the system and I love it and this is what we've been doing, and someone comes in and says, hey, we're getting rid of that, we're going to be doing something different, there's automatically a panic. There's just like a sense of loss, a sense of the loss of normalcy. What do I do? How do I do it? But if you press in, there's a season of adaptation where, okay, it's not the way it used to be. I'm going to have to adapt a few things, and jury's still out, but I'm game. Let's see how this goes. Third stage of that is there's a new normal. You've adapted enough to where now you're going, okay, I like this. This works. And then you get to the phase, which is, again, it can be a long time coming. This is where the culture change has to be long, and you got to be resolute in it, is that you get to the stage, I wouldn't go back. So it's where you get to a stage of what I call you never knew you always wanted it. So it's the thing you never knew you always wanted. You in the moment, panic. I don't want this. You rail against it. I don't want to do this. You adapt to it. There's a new normal. And then you're like, how did I ever live without this? I think about an iPhone, right? iPhone never existed. And then it was there. People got it and said, how did I live without this?
Yeah.
It's the thing you never knew you always wanted.
It used to be every couple of years, Facebook would like redo the app,
right,
and redo the website. You're like, oh, it's terrible. I hate Facebook now. I never.
Right.
And then 2 weeks later, you're like, oh,
right. Great. And so what I would say, this is kind of an added bonus point, if you will. Like you have to be like, change needs to be constant. There always needs to be a change. If you are resting on what God did last week, last month, last year, you're not looking for new fruit. You're looking at the fruit of the past and saying, man, wasn't it cool when? That's great and all. Like I love setting up memorial stones at the Jordan River and saying, man, do you remember when God did that thing? Yeah, but we've got to move on into the promised land. There's a new thing he wants to do. You can't live out of the old wineskins, right? He's got new wine. You got to have the new wineskin. You've got to be ready for what God's going to do in the future. And too many churches, they die, if you will, because they're more focused on what God did than what God's doing or wants to do. And so you just have to be ready. And so what I've gotten my church, again, I don't know if they're all there yet, but they know that change is normal. So when you get to a culture, but that change takes time. Some people don't like change and they'll leave. So you've got to be prepared for that. But if you're ready for that, God's going to do some great things through it, because I've just, one of the things that I don't do it often, and I don't do it to spite people, but like as our church has grown, we've had to change our seating in the sanctuary. And we're creatures of habit. And all of a sudden, people who fit in this 3-dimensional space, they always fit in that one. But now their seat is different. It's at a different angle. It's in a different row structure. This is a change I was not ready for. And it's funny. I don't do this. I've done it a couple of times just to see how people react. But when I people watch, and I watch people come into what is a familiar space with an unfamiliar chair, it's rattling a little bit. But if it's consistent, knowing, hey, there's a change. Ooh, I wonder what this is for. And you're preparing people for it. You're letting them know, hey, there's a reason behind this. People start trusting you.
Yeah.
They start, okay, he knows what he's doing. Remember the last change? Look at how it's done now. But you always got to be willing to, make a change and go, hey, that wasn't the right change. We're going to go back on this one.
Yeah, there was that book, Who Moved My Cheese, right? And then
yes,
I was in Canada a couple weeks ago, and there was a lady there. They were talking about change basically, but she was saying that she had a dream about being in the church auditorium and there was a hole in the chair that she was sitting in. And then the next week they got new chairs and she sat down and the chair she sat down had a hole, brand new chair had a hole in it. And she's like, this is my God chair, right? And so anytime like God sent me this chair. And so anytime they would change the chairs, she would go find that chair and she would bring it back to her spot.
That's my chair.
That's my funny chair, you know.
That's great.
And I don't know what that means, but I was reminded of Wolfgang Simpson, his book, the House Church book. He maps out, which is just a map out of change, is that people go from the mountaintop, which is and the house church thing would be, okay, you're part of a traditional church model,
right?
And then you're kind of like, well, maybe God's calling me something different, but apply anything to it, apply discipleship to it. And you think it's programs, you think it's small group, you think it's fellowship meals, you think it's whatever. But then you start saying, okay, well, I'm not growing closer to Jesus through these things that I thought were discipling. So you get maybe like a little questioning about it, a little disgruntled about it, whatever. So you descend down the mountain, into the valley, into the wilderness. And, you got to cross the wilderness, you got to cross the Jordan, and get to the promised land. Right. And a good leader knows how to get people, like we all have, when we experience change, we all have to go through the wilderness time. Right. And when you're in the wilderness, you're always looking back going, maybe the mountain was better than I thought, but you keep getting called to the new thing. And a good leader knows how to communicate, knows how to lead, knows how to shepherd, knows, how to maneuver and communicate and all of that. But once you finally get to that new spot, you're like, yeah, this is better. And I'm not saying house church is better, but that was his example. But and he wasn't saying house church was better. He was just explaining a process of change that we walk through that involves wilderness experiences. And that's where a lot of our churches are at, but they don't necessarily have a direction to know. They're like, we're not who we used to be, but we're not sure quite where we're trying to get to, and discipleship is a big answer to that.
Yeah. So that leads me to kind of the practical side. So I want, the listeners, I want them to take away some tangibles. And the reason why is because, again, we can talk, hypotheticals, we can talk the 30,000 foot view culture, but I want to share the things that I have experienced over the last, I would say at least 4 years, if not 5, what it looks like for me. So kind of my third point would be, you have to be the change you want to see. So that was really more for me, recognizing that if you're in a lead role, if you're in a ministry lead role, if you're in a pastoral role, you're trying to change a culture from the driver's seat. But at the end of the day, if you don't change and you're just wanting everybody else to change, it's never going to work. So what I would say this for everyone in the pulpit, for everyone preaching, hey, we got to make disciples, or even if you're just right now going, okay, I hear you, we got to make disciples. You have to make disciples. This is it's not relegated to a sub-ministry in your church. It's not relegated to, I'll hire a pastor to oversee that. Maybe you'll have someone oversee it, but if you're having him oversee it and you're not doing it, you're a hearer and not a doer. Mm-hmm. You're exactly what James is calling out in James chapter 2. You have to be not just a hearer, but a hearer and a doer. And let me be even more specific. And I'm going to probably put my finger on a wound. You need to hear this. I preach every weekend is not a disciple-making strategy. That is what we're called to do. Can it help? Yes. Does it? Yes. Is that a strategy? No. That is what we're called to do. Acts 2:42, and they continued to do these things. We're to continue to do those things, but there needs to be intentionality. Because here's the thing, if you look at what Jesus did, Jesus never called people to a sermon. He never said, hey guys, got this really great sermon series I want you to listen to. He would preach while they're walking. Parables, sermons. There was the Sermon on the Mount, sure, but he never said, hey, this time next week I'll be here. I got more for you. There's a new sermon series. You have to walk with people. You have to talk with people. You have to invest in people. You cannot think that the downstream culture is going to change because you preached a banger sermon on the Sermon on the Mount. You have to recognize you have to do the work. So what is this? So let me give you some practicals. First step that we did, and this is what you need to do, you need to define your terms. Because again, you can preach on the weekends and you can say the word disciple making. And I found it's the same. It works the same for the word gospel, the word church, the word disciple making. I mean, there's all these church words that we all nod. Yeah. But we all miss what we're talking about. Jim Thomas and I wrote a book on it, The Language of Disciple Making, because if you're not defining what you're talking about, your terms, people will all nod in agreement and you'll all go different directions. Because, oh, disciple making, you mean small groups. Oh, disciple making, you mean preaching on the Sundays. Oh, disciple making, you mean one-on-one. Oh, disciple making, you mean men's group. Oh, disciple making, you mean. And so everyone has their own mental idea of what you're talking about. So if you're not defining your terms, so I'm talking about whether it's in your boardroom, whether it's in your pastoral team, whether it's you sitting down and defining, what do you mean by these words? So like, for instance, we borrowed a little bit, well, a lot from Discipleship.org. So, but here's what I do. I'll give you boots on the ground. I stopped using the word Christian for the most part. It's not a bad word. I don't correct people. No, you can't use that word. It's not that. But the word Christian is too loaded. It's too just out there. Everyone's a Christian. So I started using the word disciple. And then every time I use the word disciple, I define it. So I say, and we need to be disciples, someone who is following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, committed to the mission of Jesus to make disciples everywhere. So everyone, when they hear the word disciple, then they hear the definition. So they know exactly what I'm talking about. So as people grow in their walk with Jesus, they're being fortified with definitions. They're being fortified with the gospel. They're being fortified by what I mean by being a disciple. So you've got to do that. You've got to go through all these words. In our book, we go through several definitions that you need to get on the same page. Then you've got to take those definitions. You've got to get your team on board. So we came up with basically a glossary. Here's our CCO definition. So everybody knows when you say this word, here's what I think of you to mean. So you've got to redefine it. You've got to say it to yourself. The whole team needs to hear that. Once you do that, and this is where I'm setting you up for maybe a gut punch, when you define your terms, tell them we're going to be intentional. We're going to make disciples who make disciples. Here's what all these words mean. Just know that not everyone is going to want to go with you. When you set the culture, when you set the team, when you set the definitions and you say, this is what God has called us to, some people say, I don't want to go. And you just have to recognize that people will not want to go with you. Jim Thomas, one of the best stories that he told me is when he came into a legacy church. And I mean, like they were around in the early 1800s. This church has been around for a while. He basically said that you've got to plow around the stumps. There's going to be people who are just staunch. Well, I'm not doing this. I've been here for 40 years, especially in a legacy church. Just plow around them. Keep going. Keep fighting the good fight of faith. Keep changing the culture. Because again, you're not going to find a magical phrase that's going to make them change. You've just got to show them and be that change. Keep going. Keep plowing around them. One day they're finally going to go. They're either going to move. They're going to take their stump and transplant it to another grove, if you will, or they're going to disintegrate. They're going to start becoming the fertilizer for what's coming next. And he tells a story of a guy who is, in his late 70s, who'd been at the church for 40 plus years. And he was having to plow around him. And eventually he was like, man, why didn't somebody tell me about this? Why didn't somebody tell me about disciple making? It's going to take some time for some people. And so just be okay with either one. People leave. It's just the nature of church. People are going to leave. People are going to say, well, this church down here, I've been doing that for 20 years. Oh, don't tell me my business. You're going to get that. So you got to be ready for it. I would say again, you gotta, if it's worth doing, it's worth waiting for. As I read that Andy Crouch quote. Another thing, practical, I would say, give people time to catch up. Because I'm a chrome-plated gas pedal and I just want to floor it. Let's go. A phrase that you've probably heard many times. When you're sick of saying it, people are just hearing it for the first time. So you've got to just give people the wide berth. Let them have time to catch up. Let them recognize that it's not always going to be fast. Let them know it's not like, again, they may be going through that panic stage still. They may be feeling a loss of their own ministry, a loss of identity because their identity was tied to their ministry. And you just said, hey, we're not doing that anymore. And they're having an identity crisis. And you're like, yeah, but look, we're going way down here. And they're like, I'm still suffering loss. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. So be prepared for that. So like when you go in and you know that you're changing the culture, not everybody wants to be in that culture. But I will tell you this is kind of a silver lining. As we began to change our culture 4 years ago, it was during COVID. I'm in California, so we had a mass exodus, not just because of the changes, but because it was COVID. It was because it was California. People are like, yeah, I'm out. A lot of people have come back. We've had a lot of people who had an opportunity to kind of go, hey, I've heard through the grapevine from friends who stayed, from people who are still doing what you're doing, people who like, I'm recognizing, gosh, there's so much fruitfulness in their life now. I'm like, man, what's going on there? What's in the water? There's a certain amount of people that don't want to be in the panic stage. They don't want to hang with you for whatever reason. And again, a whole host of reasons that I don't have time to mention all of them here. But that's okay, right? The kingdom's bigger than your church. Kingdom's bigger than one church. We're all part of the church, the kingdom. So understand some people are going to go and sow their seeds elsewhere. And that's okay. You got to be okay with that. Because again, if you're trying to create a culture of disciple making, not everyone's going to want to go, but they may find themselves back in your vineyard at some point. So don't get discouraged. Don't grow weary in doing good. And like you said, Matt, the faithfulness, I think sometimes we miss that that's actually what we're called to. Again, if we're stewards, like I think of it as a relay race, most disciple making, it is. You're running with the baton for a certain amount of time, but always mentally at some point, as I round the bend, there's going to be a guy with his hand out. And so that last leg of the race, you stretched it out, he's got his hand back, and for a time, you're both holding on to it, and then you let go. And now it's his turn to run. So for me, it's just recognizing that we're all temporary. I want to create a culture that's going to outlast me. So for me, that's my goal. So if I get 10, 15, 20 years to do this, I want the guy who comes up after me to stand on my shoulders. And that means I got to create a robust culture, good structure, good fruitfulness, so that he can participate in the 30, 60, 100 fold. So again, that for me is creating a culture. Curriculum's great, but if you don't create the culture or have a mindset that it's going to take a while and you got to have to press in, you're going to miss it.
Oh, that's really good. And yeah, I think the other part of that too is, like you said, the seasonality of our ministry is that there will be people who follow, you in the ministry. And that means that, you have to act in a trustworthy manner. You have to build trust among the people so that, you leverage that next person for success too, so that the congregation is not like, oh, here's another one, what's he going to do? It's like, here we go again. It's like if they can kind of get that deep and profound trust and have good, like you said, a good handoff processes, not just even with volunteers, but also with, paid staff, and that people can see it was amicable and clean and healthy and spiritually minded, and there's direction and continuity and vision. Like all of that is just so important.
Well, and again, even in those, I think of transitions, like we've had several transitions and they only work well if everybody's invested in seeing God glorified and to protect the sheep. When they don't go well, when one party or the other goes, you know what? And then things fly off because we're not being spirit led and people think they're slighted or whatever. So just keep kingdom focused. If you recognize that, again, I just, in one of my classes that I'm studying for right now, reading the history of basically the propagation of evangelicalism in America. And man, there's people you've never heard of that were generational, and they gave guys who you have heard of their start. So don't grow weary in doing good. You may not be the guy. You may be the guy that pours into the guy who pours into the guy who ends up writing a book about, man, he was that guy. But faithfulness, like there's no famous people in heaven. Jesus is famous in heaven. We're all part of the kingdom work. We're all just tools in the master's belt for his use. Mm-hmm. And I want to be used for the thing he's called me to do. And if that's to preach and teach, cool. If that's to cultivate disciples on the back end, cool. If that is to prepare pastors for a culture change, cool. If that's to take a back seat at some point because God's got a new guy, cool. You know, you got to wear this like a loose garment. You're seasonal. Everyone's seasonal.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about Bonhoeffer and what y'all are doing.
Yeah. So the Bonhoeffer Project, you know, again, I'm not just the CEO. I'm also a client. You know, I'm one of these guys that I got into it because what I saw in it was not typical. It was atypical because again, this is not throwing stones at curriculum-based disciple-making organizations. Like I said, listen, we've got a curriculum, but the curriculum isn't the goal. The curriculum is a tool. What the Bonhoeffer Project did for me was help me to create a plan, to create a culture, to create disciples. So it's really more wrestling through these things that I've talked about here with other people who have done it so that you can mitigate some of the pitfalls that I've gone through. So again, so you can stand on my shoulders. So what we've done, normally we're a 10-month cohort, and you get in and, you know, we go what we call upstream to the headwaters of the gospel, re-examine your gospel. Again, what I'd say is you think you've got the gospel is locked down, define it. Ask your people to define it, because you're gonna get hundreds of answers, because the gospel is many things all tied into the one thing. So we go and examine the gospel, because one of the things that we say is the gospel you preach or the gospel you proclaim determines the disciple you're going to produce. If you're not preaching the kingdom gospel, you're producing a disciple of something else. Mm-hmm. Your church, leadership structure, philosophy of ministry, pastor, whatever. So we start there. We look at what Jesus did. How did Jesus make disciples? How do we model what he did? And then we go into helping you develop your plan. So what we've done though is we've got two types of cohorts. We've got the 10-month cohort. You can just do straight on all the way through, or we've broken it up into modules where you could take the first one and it really reinvigorates you for the gospel. And I promise you, if you take that, we will tear you down in the most beautiful way possible and build you up, because it is and was for me the most eye-opening part of the Bonhoeffer Project. I always knew I was going to make disciples. I always knew I needed a plan. So I always knew that was in the end, we're going to make disciples. They're going to help me make a plan. I always knew that part, but it was that first section of examining the gospel I preached and proclaimed. It was brutally, it was the biggest gut punch I've ever had in ministry, because as pastors, we gospel. That's what we do. I'm all about the gospel. Don't tell me I don't know the gospel. And then you get into this and you're like, oh my gosh, I've been woefully underselling what the gospel is. I've been woefully deficient in my presentation of what the gospel is. I've been rudimentary in my telling people what the gospel is, instead of the fullness. And again, that's a cultural thing. We've lowered the bar on the gospel. What is the bare minimum? How do we get people to say that prayer and get in?
Yeah, the gospel had that book, The Discipleship Gospel, right? that kind of
exactly
hones in
right.
on
It
that
hones
topic.
in on that.
Really good.
Absolutely. So we broke it up into 3 modules. So you got your gospel, you've got the ways and means of Jesus. What did he do? How did he make disciples? And then our module 3 now is developing your own plan. So what it does is it gives people more of latitude, because if they don't have 3 months or 10 months to do the whole thing, they just jump into the 3 month, then they could take a break, do the next 3 months, and then take a break and do another 3 months as the Lord gives them the timing, or as they have the
Now,
time.
are those in cohorts, or that's asynchronous individual? Or
yeah, it's all in cohorts. We think the best way to do it is with a leader who's walking you through. So these are pastors and ministry leaders who have all gone through this process. And you're also with people who are in the same boat that you are. So you've got that lead guy who's done the culture change in their own, context as a lead pastor, ministry leader, director. And you're also then with brothers and sisters in Christ who are wrestling through the same things that you're wrestling through. And so you find just there's a beauty in how much we don't know. and you're doing that with other people, so you don't feel completely out of, fish out of water. So you do that in a place where people may ask the question that you never thought to ask, but you're going to so benefit from the fact that they asked that, and you need to know the answer.
That's really good. So how would they get in touch with that if somebody wants to look into that?
Yeah, you can hit me up. You can go info@thebonhoefferproject.com. You can go to our website. Again, it lays out our process. Bill Hull, who is a prolific writer of disciple-making resources, one of the, I would say, modern day fathers of disciple-making. He wrote the curriculum that we use. He makes an appearance, still actually leads cohorts for us as well. So, he's still engaged in the process. He's still engaged with the organization. But yeah, they reach out to me, Dan at the Bonhoeffer Project, or you can go onto our website, get more information. You can watch some of our videos, testimonials. We have a lot of church planting networks that use us for their disciple making kind of resource, right? They outsource to us to, before we have missions organizations that send their people to us for robust missions training, for robust discipleship training in missions. Church planters, they go through us before they get sent out to plant. So we've got a lot of different opportunities for people to partner with us, but it's phenomenal. And it's one of the things I never thought I'd be involved in. And not only did I get to be involved in it, but now I get to head up this organization. And it's been a joy for me.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for all you do, Dan. Is there maybe a last thought that you want to?
No, I just encourage people, press in. The culture change is hard, but just understand there's people who are doing it with you, who have gone a few steps ahead of you. Learn from them. Take, that Titus 2, old men teach the younger men, right? So I wouldn't consider myself fully old yet, but I'm in that middle age where I've gone through some things, and I want to encourage those who are even maybe older than me, but think, oh man, this is for a younger guy. No, it's for everybody. Press into the culture change, because we need it. We need it in our culture. We need more disciple-making pastors, more disciple-making leaders, disciple-making ministries and churches. That's what we need. We need more of it, not less.
So there will be people who are pastors watching this who are like, okay, I need to press in, but there's also going to be people who are members of the church, who you need to be able to support your leadership if they're kind of going this route. Because when you're in that pastoral role or that leadership role, and sometimes you can feel kind of isolated or alone, or like, does anyone get it? Are they following along? And to have other voices come along and go, we affirm the direction, we affirm what you're doing, to be able to, we can sometimes just assume, they're getting support, they know, but it's like, reach out to your leadership. If you see them taking this direction, and affirm it, bless it,
Absolutely.
Pray for them,
pray for your leaders, pray for your pastors, man. They need it.
Absolutely.
They need it.
All right. Well, appreciate you, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you, brother.
All right.